By the spring of 1942, Britain was slowly strangling. The island nation imported 55 million tons of supplies annually before the war, and now those arteries were being severed one convoy at a time. Admiral Dönitz had perfected his wolfpack tactics, coordinating groups of up to 20 U-boats to converge on merchant convoys under the cover of darkness. In March alone, his submarines sank 273 Allied vessels. Winston Churchill would later confess that the U-boat peril was the only thing during the entire war that truly frightened him. The mathematics were brutally simple. Britain needed to import at least 26 million tons of cargo each year merely to survive, let alone fight. Yet shipping losses were outpacing construction by a terrifying margin. The Germans had cracked the Royal Navy's convoy codes, and Dönitz was reading Allied shipping routes almost in real time. His submarines would position themselves across the predicted paths like invisible tripwires, surfacing at night to attack with torpedoes before disappearing beneath the waves. Escort vessels would rush to the scene, but more often than not, the U-boats had already slipped away into the black Atlantic depths. The standard British response to a submarine contact was the depth charge, a weapon that had changed remarkably little since the First World War. These cylindrical canisters, packed with Torpex explosive, were rolled off the stern of a destroyer or corvette, sinking to a preset depth before detonating. The principle was straightforward enough. A submarine caught within roughly 6 meters of a 300-pound charge would suffer catastrophic damage. The concussive force would rupture pressure hulls, shatter instruments, and kill crew members through violent internal injuries, even without a direct breach. On paper, the depth charge seemed adequate. In practice, it was failing disastrously. Throughout 1941 and into 42, Royal Navy escorts were attacking confirmed submarine contacts with depressing regularity and achieving confirmed kills with depressing rarity. The statistics told a grim story. For every 100 depth charge attacks carried out against U-boats, fewer than 9 resulted in a confirmed destruction. That meant over 90% of the time, the submarine escaped to hunt again another day. Escort captains grew increasingly frustrated. They would gain solid sonar contact, maneuver into attack position, release a pattern of depth charges, and wait for the telltale oil slick and debris that signaled a kill. Instead, they would circle back to find nothing. The U-boat had vanished. Some commanders began to suspect their equipment was faulty. Others blamed inadequate training. A few whispered that perhaps the Germans had developed some new defensive technology that rendered depth charges obsolete. The truth was far more fundamental, and it lay hidden in a technical limitation that everyone knew about but nobody had properly addressed. The problem was not the explosive power of the depth charges. It was not the training of the crews. It was not German countermeasures. The problem was geometry, pure and simple, and it was built into the very nature of how escorts prosecuted their attacks. Meanwhile, in a converted basement office in London, a small team of unconventional weapons designers had already identified the flaw. They were working on something that the traditional naval establishment would ridicule as absurd, a contraption that looked more like a medieval siege weapon than a modern anti-submarine device. Their solution would eventually transform the Battle of the Atlantic, but first they would have to overcome an enemy nearly as formidable as the U-boats themselves, the institutional pride of the Royal Navy. The fatal flaw was called the dead zone, and every escort captain in the Atlantic lived with its consequences. To understand why depth charges were failing, one must first understand how a warship located a submerged submarine. The primary detection tool was ASTIC, the British name for active sonar. An operator would send out a pulse of sound energy, a distinctive ping, and listen for the echo bouncing back from a submarine's hull. By measuring the time delay and the direction of the return signal, he could calculate the bearing and range to the target. ASDIC was a remarkable technology for its era, but it had a critical limitation. The sound beam projected forward and downward from the ship's hull in a cone shape. At long range, this cone covered a reasonably wide vertical area. However, as the escort vessel closed in on the target, the geometry changed unfavorably. At approximately 200 yards from the submarine, the ASDIC beam would pass over the top of a U-boat lurking at depth. The target would literally slip beneath the searching sound waves. Contact would be lost. This meant that for the final 200 yards of every attack run, the escort was blind. The captain was driving towards the last known position of a target that had vanished from his instruments. He was guessing, and the U-boat commander knew it. A skilled German captain would wait for that telltale moment when the destroyer's ASDIC pings stopped hitting his hull. He would then order an immediate turn, perhaps 30 degrees to port or starboard, and a change in depth. By the time the depth charges splashed into the water and sank to their preset detonation level, the U-boat might be 50 or even 100 meters away from where the escort expected it to be. The explosions would boom through the water, the submarine would shake and groan, but the crew would survive. 20 minutes later, after the escort had moved on to search elsewhere, the U-boat would resume its patrol. The mathematics were unforgiving. A destroyer steaming at 15 knots would cover those 200 yards of blind approach in roughly 23 seconds. Add the time required to actually drop the charges over the stern and for them to sink to depth, and a submarine had perhaps 45 seconds to evade. That might sound brief, but a Type 7 U-boat making 8 knots underwater could cover nearly 200 meters in that time. The combination of lateral movement and depth change created an enormous volume of ocean where the submarine might actually be hiding. Royal Navy tacticians attempted various solutions. They developed patterns that spread depth charges across wider areas. They experimented with slower approach speeds to maintain ASDIC contact longer. They tried throwing charges from the sides of the ship using K-guns, creating broader attack patterns. None of these fixes addressed the fundamental problem. The charges still went into the water astern of the attacking vessel. The submarine still had those precious 45 seconds. What the Navy needed was a weapon that could strike the submarine while the ship still held ASDIC contact before the target disappeared into that lethal blind zone. The charges would have to go into the water ahead of the ship, not behind it. This concept, though blindingly obvious in retrospect, represented a radical departure from 2 decades of anti-submarine doctrine. It would require throwing explosives forward over the bow while steaming at attack speed, a notion that most senior officers considered impractical at best and dangerous at worst. The man who would solve this problem worked in one of the most peculiarly named departments in British military history. Commander Charles Frederick Goodeve was a Canadian-born physicist who had joined the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve before the war. By 1940, he found himself assigned to the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, an organization whose deliberately vague title concealed some of the most innovative weapons work of the entire conflict. The department operated from offices in central London, where Goodeve gathered a team of scientists, engineers, and naval officers who shared one crucial trait. They were willing to question conventional wisdom. Goodeve understood the blind zone problem intimately. He had studied the attack geometry and concluded that the entire philosophy of stern-launched weapons was fundamentally flawed. The solution, he argued, was to throw the explosives ahead of the ship while ASDIC contact was still maintained. Rather than attacking where the submarine had been, the escort would attack where the submarine actually was. The concept was elegant in theory. Making it work in practice would require solving several formidable engineering challenges. The first problem was propulsion. Any forward-thrown weapon would need to clear the ship's bow, travel a meaningful distance, and enter the water in a predictable pattern. Goodeve's team experimented with spigot mortars, a technology that dated back centuries but had been refined during the First World War for trench weapons. A spigot mortar worked by placing a projectile over a fixed rod. When propellant charges fired, expanding gases would throw the projectile forward. The system was mechanically simple, requiring no complex loading mechanisms or precision-manufactured barrels. The second challenge was the explosive mechanism. Traditional depth charges used hydrostatic fuses, detonating when water pressure reached a preset level, corresponding to a specific depth. This required guessing how deep the submarine would be when the charge arrived. Goodeve proposed something different. His projectiles would use contact fuses, detonating only upon striking something solid. If a bomb missed the submarine, it would sink harmlessly to the bottom without exploding. This seemingly minor change would prove tactically revolutionary, though its significance was not immediately appreciated. By early 1941, Goodeve's team had developed a working prototype. The launcher consisted of 24 spigot mortars arranged in rows on a steel frame mounted on a ship's foredeck. Each mortar held a 32-pound bomb, fitted with a contact fuse and enough Torpex explosive to punch through a submarine's pressure hull. When fired electrically in a rippling sequence, the 24 projectiles would arc forward approximately 250 yards ahead of the ship, splashing into the water in an elliptical pattern roughly 40 meters wide and 60 meters long. The weapon's appearance was distinctly unglamorous. The launcher resembled industrial plumbing more than sophisticated military hardware. The bombs themselves had stabilizing fins that folded outward during flight, giving them a spiky appearance that someone thought resembled a hedgehog. The name stuck, despite being entirely unofficial. Admiralty documents would refer to the system as the anti-submarine projector Mark 10, but every sailor who ever fired one would call it the Hedgehog. Goodeve submitted his proposal to the naval staff with cautious optimism. He had solved the geometry problem, eliminated the blind zone, and created a weapon that could strike while contact was still held. He had no idea that his greatest battle was about to begin, not against German submarines, but against his own senior officers. The Admiralty's response to Goodeve's invention ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. Senior officers who had spent their careers perfecting depth charge tactics viewed the Hedgehog as an insult to their professional expertise. The objections came thick and fast, and they revealed as much about institutional psychology as they did about genuine technical concerns. The first criticism targeted the weapon's lack of feedback. When a pattern of depth charges detonated underwater, the explosions were thunderous and unmistakable. Massive columns of water erupted behind the ship. The deck vibrated. Everyone aboard knew that something violent had happened beneath the surface. Even if the attack missed, the crew felt they had struck back at their invisible enemy. The Hedgehog, by contrast, offered nothing of the sort. If the bombs missed their target, they sank silently to the seabed without exploding. There would be no satisfying blast, no visible confirmation that an attack had taken place. Critics argued this would devastate crew morale. Rear Admiral Gilbert Stevenson, one of the most influential voices in anti-submarine warfare, dismissed the weapon during a 1941 demonstration. He reportedly called it crude and insufficiently robust for Atlantic conditions. Other officers questioned whether the contact fuses would function reliably after the projectiles smashed into the water at high speed. They worried about the bombs detonating prematurely on deck or failing to detonate at all upon striking a submarine. The Hedgehog, they concluded, was a clever laboratory experiment unsuited to the brutal realities of convoy escort duty. There was also an uncomfortable political dimension. The depth charge had powerful institutional defenders within the Royal Navy's ordnance establishment. Factories were producing them by the thousands. Training programs had been built around their deployment. Tactical doctrines had been written, revised, and standardized. Adopting the Hedgehog would implicitly acknowledge that this entire apparatus had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. For officers whose careers were invested in existing methods, such an admission was professionally threatening. Goodeve and his supporters fought back with data. They pointed out that the contact fuse system actually provided superior feedback when it mattered most. A Hedgehog attack that hit the submarine would produce an unmistakable explosion. Silence meant a miss. This binary outcome was far more useful than the ambiguous eruptions of depth charges, which told commanders nothing about whether they had actually hit anything. A captain watching his Hedgehog bombs explode underwater could be certain he had struck the target. A captain watching depth charges detonate knew only that his weapons had reached their preset depth. The technical arguments failed to persuade the doubters. What finally began shifting opinion was operational necessity. Throughout 1941, U-boat kills remained agonizingly scarce despite countless attacks. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost, and increasingly desperate Admiralty officials began reconsidering weapons they had previously rejected. In October 1941, HMS Dawnstep became the first escort fitted with the Hedgehog system. Several other corvettes and destroyers followed over the winter months, though deployment remained limited and controversial. The critics had one final objection, perhaps the most revealing of all. The Hedgehog required approaching the submarine directly, bow on, rather than passing over and dropping charges astern. This meant the escort would be pointing straight at the U-boat during the attack run. If the submarine fired a torpedo at that moment, the escort would be steering directly into its path. The weapon, they argued, was not merely crude, it was suicidal. The mechanics of the Hedgehog system were deceptively straightforward, which was precisely why it worked so brilliantly under combat conditions. The launcher assembly mounted on the foredeck consisted of 4 rows of 6 spigot mortars each, angled forward at approximately 45 degrees. Each spigot held a single projectile weighing roughly 32 pounds, of which about 25 pounds was Torpex high explosive. The bombs measured just under 18 inches in length and featured a rounded nose housing the all-important contact fuse. When the captain ordered an attack, an electrical firing circuit ignited the propellant charges in a carefully timed sequence. The bombs did not launch simultaneously. Instead, they rippled outward in pairs over approximately 1 second, with slight variations in angle between rows. This staggered firing created the distinctive elliptical impact pattern that made the weapon so effective. The projectiles arced through the air for roughly 250 yards before splashing into the sea ahead of the ship. Upon entering the water, they assumed a nose-down attitude and sank at predictable velocities toward the submarine below. The contact fuse mechanism was elegantly simple. A striker pin at the nose of each bomb was held in place by a safety mechanism that armed only after the projectile had traveled a safe distance from the ship. Upon striking any solid object, the striker would compress inward, initiating the detonation chain. The resulting explosion was concentrated and violent, easily capable of breaching the 8mm pressure hull of a Type 7 U-boat. Crucially, if the bomb struck nothing, it would continue sinking until water pressure crushed the casing or it reached the seabed, remaining inert throughout. This contact-only detonation principle represented a profound tactical advantage that even some Hedgehog supporters initially underestimated. With traditional depth charges, an attack that missed would still produce massive underwater explosions. These detonations disrupted ASDIC conditions for several minutes, scattering sound waves and creating turbulence that made regaining contact extremely difficult. The escort would be forced to circle blindly, waiting for conditions to settle while the submarine crept away. Many U-boats escaped precisely because the failed attacks that missed them also blinded their pursuers. The Hedgehog eliminated this problem entirely. A miss produced no explosion whatsoever. ASDIC conditions remained undisturbed. The escort could immediately begin another attack run without waiting for acoustic clarity. If the first pattern missed, a second could follow within minutes. The submarine had no breathing room, no recovery time, no opportunity to exploit the chaos of exploding charges. Either the Hedgehog bombs found their target, or the hunt continued uninterrupted. The elliptical pattern itself was calculated to maximize kill probability against a maneuvering submarine. The impact zone covered approximately 140 feet in length and 120 feet in width, with bombs spaced roughly 20 feet apart. A U-boat measuring 218 feet in length and 20 feet in beam would find it nearly impossible to fit between the splashes. Even if the submarine turned during the attack, some portion of its hull would almost certainly intersect with at least one bomb's descent path. The mathematics transformed the equation entirely. Where depth charges required the submarine to be within a 6-meter lethal radius of a single explosion, the Hedgehog created 24 separate chances for a direct hit across a much larger area. A commander did not need to guess the submarine's exact depth or predict its evasive course. He simply needed to maintain ASDIC contact and fire while the target remained within his sonar picture. The first confirmed Hedgehog kill came on the 6th of February 1942, though the circumstances remained classified for years afterward. HMS Dawnstep, a Flower-class corvette operating in the western approaches, detected a submerged contact approximately 15 miles from a homebound convoy. Her captain ordered an approach at moderate speed, maintaining ASDIC contact throughout. At roughly 200 yards range, the Hedgehog launcher fired. Seconds later, 2 distinct explosions rumbled up from the depths. Oil and debris surfaced within minutes, confirming the destruction of U-582. The kill registered quietly within Admiralty intelligence circles. There was no public announcement, no congratulatory signals to the fleet. The Hedgehog remained operationally secret, and besides, one success did not constitute vindication. Critics pointed out that depth charges had also scored occasional kills throughout 1941. A single engagement proved nothing about overall effectiveness. What the Navy needed was statistical evidence across hundreds of attacks, and that data would take time to accumulate. Throughout the spring and summer of 1942, more escorts received Hedgehog installations. The fitting process was relatively straightforward, requiring only the deck, mounting and electrical connections to the bridge firing controls. Crews underwent brief training programs, practicing the new attack geometry that brought them bow on toward the submarine rather than passing overhead. Many captains remained skeptical. The absence of explosions during missed attacks felt deeply unsatisfying, almost as though they had not truly engaged the enemy. Yet the kills began accumulating. HMS Dawnstep scored again in April. Other escorts followed with confirmed destructions through the summer months. By autumn, Admiralty analysts had enough data to perform preliminary statistical comparisons. The numbers, when they emerged, were startling. Hedgehog attacks were achieving kill rates approaching 25%. This meant roughly 1 in 4 attacks was resulting in a confirmed submarine destruction. Depth charges, by comparison, remained mired below 10%. The disparity was difficult to explain away. Both weapons were being deployed against similar targets under comparable conditions. The training programs used identical ASDIC techniques up to the moment of firing. The only variable was the weapons system itself. Slowly, reluctantly, the institutional resistance began crumbling. Officers who had dismissed the Hedgehog as crude were forced to reckon with evidence that crudeness was proving devastatingly effective. By early 1943, production orders accelerated dramatically. American shipyards began manufacturing their own version for the United States Navy, designated the Mark X projector. British factories increased output to equip every available escort. The weapon that had languished in bureaucratic opposition for over a year was suddenly a priority program. Convoys that had endured the U-boat onslaught of 1942 would now sail, with escorts carrying forward-throwing weapons capable of striking while contact was maintained. The psychological impact on U-boat crews began manifesting in intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations. German submariners had grown accustomed to the rhythm of depth charge attacks. They knew the escort would lose contact. They knew they had time to evade. They understood the survival calculus. The Hedgehog changed everything. Submarines were now dying without warning, destroyed by explosions that came from ahead rather than above. There was no telltale moment when ASDIC pings stopped, no 45 seconds of maneuverability. Crews reported feeling hunted in ways they never had before. The Battle of the Atlantic had not yet turned decisively. That would require the convergence of multiple factors throughout 1943. But beneath the waves, German commanders were beginning to understand that something fundamental had shifted. The statistical revelation came in stages, each successive analysis reinforcing conclusions that the Admiralty could no longer ignore. By the summer of 1943, operational research teams had compiled comprehensive attack data spanning 18 months of Hedgehog deployment. The figures demolished every argument that critics had marshalled against the weapon. Where depth charges achieved confirmed kills in approximately 9% of attacks, the Hedgehog was destroying submarines in roughly 25 to 30% of engagements. The weapon had not merely improved upon existing methods, it had tripled the kill rate. The operational research section broke down the numbers with forensic precision. Between 1942 and 1943, escorts armed with Hedgehog conducted 268 attacks against confirmed submarine contacts. 67 of those attacks resulted in verified destructions. The percentage fluctuated slightly depending on how borderline cases were classified, but the central finding remained unassailable. A submarine caught by a Hedgehog-equipped escort faced odds of survival dramatically worse than one pursued by depth charge attackers. These statistics reached the highest levels of Allied command. Churchill himself received briefings on anti-submarine effectiveness, and the Hedgehog data featured prominently in assessments of the Atlantic campaign. American naval leadership, initially skeptical of British weapons innovations, accelerated their own adoption program. By mid-1943, United States Navy destroyer escorts were rolling off construction lines with Hedgehog launchers already installed. The production facilities in both nations struggled to meet demand that had seemed unimaginable 18 months earlier. Across the Atlantic, the evidence was registering in German assessments as well. Admiral Dönitz maintained meticulous records of U-boat losses, analysing each destruction for tactical lessons. His war diary entries from 1943 reflect growing concern about British weapons developments. While he did not specifically name the Hedgehog in contemporaneous documents, post-war interrogations revealed that German intelligence had identified the forward-throwing weapon and understood its significance. Dönitz's memoirs, published in 1958, acknowledged that Allied anti-submarine technology had evolved faster than German countermeasures could adapt. The impact extended beyond raw kill statistics. U-boat commanders were now hesitating during attacks, breaking off engagements earlier, diving deeper upon first detection. These behavioral changes reduced their effectiveness against convoys even when they survived. A submarine running deep and silent to avoid Hedgehog attacks was a submarine not firing torpedoes at merchant ships. The weapon was saving Allied vessels through deterrence as well as destruction. May 1943 marked the turning point that historians would later call Black May for the Kriegsmarine. 43 U-boats were destroyed that single month, losses so catastrophic that Dönitz temporarily withdrew his forces from the North Atlantic convoy routes. Multiple factors contributed to this disaster: improved radar, broken German codes, long-range aircraft patrols, and increased escort numbers. But the Hedgehog was woven throughout. Submarines that might previously have escaped depth charge attacks were dying beneath contact-fused projectiles, fired while ASDIC contact held firm. The institutional resistance that had delayed the weapon's deployment now seemed almost incomprehensible. Officers who had championed depth charges quietly revised their positions. Training programs that had taught stern attack geometry were rewritten around forward-throwing tactics. The Royal Navy, for all its traditions and hierarchies, eventually acknowledged that an unglamorous weapon designed by unconventional thinkers had outperformed systems refined across 2 decades. Charles Goodeve received recognition for his contributions, though never the public acclaim that might have accompanied a more conventional military achievement. His Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development continued producing innovations throughout the war. The Hedgehog's influence extended far beyond the final German surrender in May 1945. Naval strategists worldwide studied the weapon's success, extracting lessons that would shape anti-submarine warfare for decades. The core insight was deceptively simple, yet profound. Attack geometry mattered as much as explosive power. A weapon that struck while contact was maintained would always outperform one that required guessing where the target might be. British weapons designers began improving upon Goodeve's original concept even before the war ended. The Squid system, entering service in late 1943, represented the next evolutionary step. Where the Hedgehog fired 24 small contact-fused bombs, the Squid launched 3 full-sized depth charges from a trainable mortar mount. These charges used time fuses set automatically by ASDIC range data, detonating at the precise depth indicated by sonar. The weapon could be aimed port or starboard, compensating for submarine maneuvers detected during the approach. Kill rates climbed higher still, approaching 50% in some operational assessments. Post-war development continued with the Limbo system, which refined the Squid concept further. Introduced in the early 1950s, Limbo became standard equipment aboard Royal Navy frigates and destroyers throughout the Cold War. The weapon's lineage traced directly back to Goodeve's basement laboratory and his stubborn insistence that explosives belonged ahead of the ship rather than behind it. Soviet submarine commanders training in the North Atlantic would face weapons descended from the crude apparatus that Admiralty officers had once dismissed as unsuitable for service. NATO navies adopted forward-throwing anti-submarine weapons universally. The United States Navy developed its own successors, including rocket-propelled depth charges that could strike targets thousands of yards distant. Every modern anti-submarine vessel carries weapons designed around the principle that Charles Goodeve championed. Maintain contact, attack immediately, eliminate the blind zone. The doctrine books may not credit him directly, but his fingerprints mark every page. The Hedgehog story carries lessons beyond military technology. Institutional resistance to innovation nearly prevented a war-winning weapon from reaching the fleet, Senior officers, invested in existing methods and protective of established doctrine, delayed deployment by precious months, while merchant ships burned and sailors drowned. The pattern repeats throughout military history. Organizations optimize for familiar problems and struggle to recognize when fundamental assumptions have become obsolete. Goodeve himself reflected on these dynamics in post-war lectures. He observed that technical innovation often succeeded only when operational necessity became overwhelming. The Admiralty embraced the Hedgehog not because they were persuaded by elegant arguments, but because their existing weapons were manifestly failing. Desperation accomplished what persuasion could not. It is a sobering observation for anyone attempting to challenge established practice within large institutions. The Battle of the Atlantic consumed roughly 72,000 Allied lives, the majority being merchant mariners who sailed unarmed ships through submarine-infested waters. 30,000 German submariners died as well, many entombed in crushed pressure hulls at the bottom of the sea. Among the weapons that determined this outcome, the Hedgehog holds a peculiar distinction. It was dismissed, ridiculed, and resisted by the very organization that needed it most. It succeeded anyway, tripling kill rates and helping turn an existential struggle toward ultimate victory. Today, the few surviving Hedgehog launchers rest in naval museums, industrial relics of a desperate era. Visitors walking past might glance briefly at the crude metal framework and spigot tubes without recognizing what they represent. Not merely a weapon, but a reminder that innovation often wears unglamorous clothing, and that the experts are not always right.